Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui, Col Ian Hutson aho. I'm the Director of the Salvation Army Social Policy and Parliamentary Unit, and each year we put out a State of the Nation report, and today we're launching our 14th report, and of course it's looking backwards on 2020, which has been an impactful year with COVID-19. So what we look at each year is we look at the well-being of people. How are our people in this nation doing? And that's what we measure, a measuring stick of what's going on. And of course with COVID-19 it's been very impactful. And so that's why this year we've given the theme of the report, Disturbed Present, Better Future, or Whakarāru o Anaia e pai aka kia anga whakamua. In a moment I'm going to hand over to the Territorial leader, the national leader of the Salvation Army in New Zealand, Commissioner Mark Campbell, and he's going to give a Salvation Army perspective on the report, and he's going to be followed by Paul Barber, a policy analyst in the unit, who is co-author of the report, and he's going to give a presentation of this report. So right now I'm just going to hand over to Commissioner Campbell to take over from here. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm very pleased to join you at what has become a feature on the Wellington calendar, the launch of our annual State of the Nation report. The New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga and Samoa territory is one of the few Salvation Army territories to have a policy unit which works very hard to study policy issues that can improve the lives of our most vulnerable brothers and sisters. As Christians, we identify closely with our neighbours and work to improve their well-being in many different ways. This is based on an imperative we see as coming from God. You shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these, from Mark 12:21. The co-founder of the Salvation Army, Catherine Booth, once said, "There is no improving the future without disturbing the present." The difficulty is to get people to be willing to be disturbed. Well, our world has now been massively disturbed. How many times have we heard the statement, unprecedented or once in a lifetime? A worldwide pandemic has rocked our world, including this little isolated island nation on the edge of the earth. New Zealand has so far fared well compared with other nations. Our economy has not been hit as severely as first anticipated, and relatively few people contracted the virus. The increased use of technology such as Zoom conference calls meant reduced travel and an increased level of connectedness for people in isolated settings, which allowed access to all kinds of help and support. Families spent unscheduled and often very rich time together, and the nation collectively pulled together, and government policies like the wage subsidies softened the economic blow for many, or at least for a time. And this is not only to highlight a few of the positives. However, there is no hiding the fact that COVID-19 has cast a large shadow over our land. Our country has been in need of significant change before the virus struck, as inequity had become entrenched in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This was reflected in levels of child poverty that many would see as completely unacceptable, but something we have almost come to accept as normal. All this was the case before the crisis, but the economic impact of COVID-19 looks set to further exacerbate this poverty and inequity. The 2021 State of the Nation report is framed with a question: disrupted present, better future. It is our desire to see that this COVID-19 crisis will lead to a restoration of hope for many who are marginalised, unable to sustain themselves with their whānau adequately. We would hope that our whānau and communities experience a kind of hope that comes from experiencing compassion expressed in social policies enacted by a compassionate and caring nation, a team of 5 million and a government with a mandate. With this in mind, the Salvation Army is urging the government to make bold and courageous policy decisions that address the entrenched poverty that successive governments have failed to deal with over the last 10 to 20 years. This is the kind of courage we believe is needed to build a hope for the better future we all want and need. I welcome you to this launch. We hope you will read the report and engage with its authors. We pray that the report will contribute to the continuing national conversation on wellbeing. On behalf of the Salvation Army, I would like to thank you so much for your interest in our ideas and your ongoing support for our work. I commend this report to you as our contribution to the debate on shaping a better future for our nation and its people. God bless you all.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm pleased to be able to share with you today some of the key messages from our 2021 State of the Nation report, Disturbed Present, Better Future. Whakaruru o e naine e pai ake kia ana whakamua. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank the co-authors of the report, Ronji Taneelu and Ana Ike, and all those who have helped make this report possible. This year's report follows the format of previous years and covers indicators across 5 areas: our children, work and incomes, housing, crime and punishment, social hazards, as well as taking a look at wellbeing and disparities affecting Māori. And our report covers a lot of ground, and indeed we look at more than 100 different statistics and measures. And we see areas of progress, but some of those areas threaten to be overwhelmed by the scale of the COVID-19 impacts that cast a shadow across our work. Inequalities seem to be being intensified and need specific focus from government and from all of us. And we're going to need to work really hard to genuinely include everyone in our team of 5 million. Well, children are a special part of the team of 5 million, and we look at 8 areas of child wellbeing. We think 3 of those areas got better. 2 of them, there were mixed results or didn't really change, and 3 got worse. If we take a look at poverty and the number of children in benefit households, child poverty statistics for the June 2020 are not due to be released until next week, and will not include the impacts of COVID-19 during most of 2020. Statistics for child poverty covering that period and the COVID impacts won't be available until February next year. There were between 151 and 235,000 children in poverty in the most recent figures available for the primary poverty measures from June 2019. And the government's families package was intended to further reduce that number of children in poverty. But when we look at 2020, along came COVID and things changed. The rapid increase in the number of people receiving income support also meant a large increase in the number of children living in households relying on a benefit. That increased by 23,000 to more than 211,000 last year in 2020. Children in households receiving a benefit are much more likely to live in income poverty, and if that's the case in 2020, then child poverty may well increase as a result. We're concerned that the additional welfare support provided during 2020 may not have been enough to prevent more children landing in poverty. And we see other signs of hardship that also point towards this effect that we talk about more in the report. If we turn to look at more positive side of the story, is that youth offending this year has continued to decrease, a trend that's been going on for more than a decade. And we can point to similar positive trends, longer term trends for teenage pregnancies and abortions also reducing. And this year it was pleasing to see a decrease in the youth suicide rate after increases in previous years. But the trend is still fluctuating, and the rate of continues to be a concern. And if we turn to think about children at risk, this year seems to have marked something of a turning point in the number of children going into state care, with the total number of children in care falling this year, and the number of children who actually entered care during the year the lowest it had been for a decade. But the picture of harm remains still very mixed for children at risk of harm through abuse and neglect, and in the trends of violence towards children. We feel there's not enough progress is happening and more needs to be done. Similarly, in education outcomes, the data we have in our main reports is from 2019 and before the impacts of COVID-19. And already we were seeing more students leaving school without qualifications and an increased disparity in outcomes between students. Initial data that is available from the Ministry of Education suggests, for 2020 and its COVID impacts, suggests that impacts on early childhood education and school attendance, that the negative impacts have tended to fall on already disadvantaged students. When we look at work and incomes, we see negative effects across all the areas that we monitor, even if overall it has not been quite as bad as was initially feared. If we look at unemployment, the wage subsidy scheme and the largely successful containment of the pandemic has certainly helped contain the growth in unemployment. But unemployment has still increased substantially during the year. And the official unemployment rate rose by 25,000. That's the purple line in the graph. And in the red line in the graph, the number of people registered as job seekers rose by more than 52,000 during the year. And the impacts of that unemployment have been falling unequally, particularly on younger people. And we also see that the number of young people not in education, training or employment is the highest it's been since 2012. And women, Māori and Pacific workers and those with disabilities have all been more affected by unemployment, and they are already more disadvantaged in the employment world. And when we look at working age benefits, there was a huge increase of 75,000 by the end of December 2020. And that was driven by the increase in the number of job seekers, but there were also a significant rise in the number of people on sole parent support. And we need to remember that these numbers are expected to remain high for the next 2 or 3 years. The government responded with huge short-term welfare responses, including the wage subsidy scheme and the COVID income relief payment. But both schemes have now ended. There are also changes to welfare benefits with the one-off increase of $25 plus indexing of benefits and thresholds to wages, and a temporary increase in the winter energy payment. But these changes are well short of that major overhaul that was foreseen in the recommendations of the Welfare Advisory Group 2 years ago. And there's still a lot that needs to be done. And if we take a look at hardship and food security, this is another sign of the pressures that families are under. The huge increase in food parcels distributed by the Salvation Army during 2020 highlights the multiple signs of growing hardship during the year. More than 113,000 parcels were distributed by the end of December, which is nearly twice what the number we distributed in 2019. There was a surge in need during the lockdown periods in April and May, which then reduced again, but by the end of the year was still well above 2019 levels. And this growth in need is also reflected in government food hardship assistance, which also rose in that April-May period and didn't decline again across the rest of the year, and more than $800 million in hardship assistance was given out, 30% higher than 2019. And amongst this is the good news of the government investing a great deal in free school lunch programs, as well as funding support for community networks to do transformational work in building greater food security in communities. And that means there's a real opportunity for transformation in this area. When we turn to look at housing, it seems that things got worse across all the areas that we monitor. And that's despite huge efforts and a lot of positive change. We seem to be caught in something of a perfect storm with issues of availability of housing and housing supply. In looking at housing, we take the perspective of those who are at the sharp end of the housing spectrum, those who are homeless, needing social housing, affordable rentals and assistance to get into home ownership. It will take more and bolder steps from government and all those involved in the housing sector to move us to a better future for housing and to escape the treadmill of rising need that seems to exceed efforts to meet that need. If we look at the housing supply and compare that to the rate of population growth over the past few years. The number of consents for new housing reached record new highs over the past year. And on the graph on the right, we see that the number of consents for housing stock has roughly kept pace with population growth on a national level. However, when we look outside of Auckland or look around the regions, there is evidence that that supply is not keeping up with the growth and changes in population. And further evidence of the pressure in the housing market is the continued steep growth in the social housing register, the number of people waiting for housing, government social housing. Those with fewer resources find it harder to meet rate increases and are pushed into urgent housing need and homelessness. And within this trend for high housing need, again, there's real signs of regional differences across the country. And in the graph here, we show how one of the other aspects of housing affordability, and that is the fact that lower quartile rents, that's the blue line in the graph, have been rising faster than growth in the average weekly wages for employees, which is another part of this housing challenge that we're in. And some of the biggest increases in rents that have been happening are happening in the lowest, in the poorest neighbourhoods. New rental laws that have come into effect just the past week are attempting to moderate rent increases and provide more secure tenancies. But it looks like more work will need to be done if we're going to help low-income renters. If we turn to crime and punishment, it's really difficult to get an overall picture of what's happening with crime in this country. And the government is taking a new direction with its justice system reforms, and it's going to take time for some of those reforms to be reflected in improved outcomes. But when we look at outcomes this year, we can really say there's been minimal changes in offending levels, but victimisations are increasing. We need to keep striving to do more for victims. Violent offending has also decreased in some areas, but it's offset by increases in other areas. So we see little change. And sentencing and imprisonment rates are reducing. And while some reoffending and recidivism rates are reducing, others are not. So the picture is mixed. And if we look, for example, at imprisonment rates, there's some real good news in that imprisonment rate overall is declining and the number of people in prison is reducing. And in this graph here, we compare the Māori imprisonment rate, the adult Māori imprisonment rate, with the total population. And although the Māori rate is also decreasing, we can see that Māori experience much higher imprisonment rates, and that disparity is not closing. Yeah, when we turn to look at social hazards, we find that the signs of improvement when looking at alcohol, gambling and illicit drugs are hard to find. And we generally feel there has been overall no change. The COVID-19 lockdowns disrupted gambling and drinking and drug use patterns, and they offered opportunities for some for change, but for others it brought social and mental pressures that were unhelpful. And we also see that problem debt continues to worsen. Recent law changes are helping to protect vulnerable consumers, but the increased hardship that people are experiencing are driving more of them into debt fueled by their economic hardship. If we look at illicit drug prosecutions over the past year, we can see a trend of the past years has continued and indeed intensified. Overall convictions are down by 27% since 2015. But the mix of prosecutions is now very much dominated by methamphetamine. COVID-19 had major impacts on drug use during the lockdown, and again there were some positive signs of decreased use and opportunities to reset for people. But post-lockdown, the pressures seem to have increased again. And we saw a similar pattern with gambling. Overall gambling losses for the year are down. Pokie machines and casinos couldn't be accessed during the lockdowns. But on the other hand, there was a sharp increase in lotto expenditures, which was the only form of gambling that continued online during lockdowns. And if we just take a quick look at problem debt, the personal consumer debt that people are living with has again risen to more than $6 billion over the past year. It has increased sharply this year and can be attributed to the financial pressures that households are under with unemployment and reduced working hours. People need to turn to high-cost lenders simply to make ends meet. And we conclude our report by looking at Māori wellbeing and inequalities. And that's also a story of disruption and progress. We've included some additional measures this year taken from the Te Kupenga survey, census surveys that measured wellbeing for Māori. And in the diagram on your screen, we have attempted to map the changes in wellbeing disparity against the He Ara Waiora framework that was developed by Treasury as part of their work on living standards and wellbeing. When we look at this diagram, it shows how the impacts affect different elements of wellbeing for Māori. And if we look closely, we see that the fragile progress in reducing disparities in things like average incomes, unemployment, and educational achievement tends to be outweighed by the continuing and large disparities around need for social housing, imprisonment rates, hazardous drinking, and illicit drugs. And what this tells us that these disparities need specific policy focus and different ways of working based on what is known to achieve better results for Māori. I mean, there's a great work already being done, but the scale of the issues suggests that much more will need to be done. Well, thanks for your time today. The State of the Nation summary and the full report are on our website at the Salvation Army, and we really welcome your feedback and comments on what we've talked and shared with you today. And so, we wish you all well, stay safe, and let's all look after each other.